On this episode of Race Talk with Lane and Eugene, Dr. Felicia Williams-Cosey, organizational diversity consultant, speaks on the topic of barriers to creating inclusive environments and how we can overcome them. The date of this episode was February 3rd, 2021. So once again, welcome to Race Talk with Lane and Eugene. We are joined this morning once again, a return guest. I know you're excited to hear her, Dr. Felicia Williams-Cosey, and I'm just going to read a brief bio and then I will cut her loose as they were, and we will have question and answer after that. Alrighty, so for over 20 years, Felicia Williams-Cosey has inspired business organizations, leaders, and individuals to go beyond the ordinary to achieve successful business relationships. A Michigan native and graduate of Michigan State University, Felicia developed her organizational change management expertise while building a career as a university professor. She taught and consulted at the Simon Bolivar University in Caracas, Venezuela, the School of Business at Boston College, and the Psychology Department and School of Engineering at Wayne State University, and currently facilitates a course on interpersonal dynamics at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Focusing on organizational effectiveness, team building, and organizational restructuring following radical organizational change, she developed an acute skill for balancing the needs of the organizational system with the people needs of her clients. Companies who have worked with Dr. Williams-Cosey have experienced improved communication between departments, increased cooperation and alignment with business goals, greater valuing and application of multicultural contributions to business success, increased individual and team performance, and more efficient utilization of human resources. Dr. Felicia Williams-Cosey, welcome back to Race Talk.
Thank you so much, Lane. It is wonderful to be back with you all. And I have to say, every time I hear that bio read, it's like, oh, who is this person? It's been quite a long journey to get where I am today. So I'd like to share with you some thoughts about organizational culture and how that fits into, hopefully for you, knowing some of the things that you can do to bring more inclusion into the organizations that you're a part of. Whether you're a volunteer or you're a paid worker in an organization, I think we're all here because we want to make changes. So I'll start by sharing some thoughts with you, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Thanks. So let's give a beginning here. Okay, so my title, An Organizational Culture of Inclusion. This is certainly something that we're moving toward. And so the question is, are we there yet? Let's look at some of the things along the journey. So as we begin, I invite you to read what James Baldwin says, and to notice, as Lane said, this is a safe environment for discussion, for agreement or disagreement, and just a little bit of a warning that some of the things that you hear here may challenge some of your existing beliefs. And if that is the case for you, in this open and safe environment, feel free to ask questions. We can challenge each other from a loving place, but I invite you into a space of curiosity. What might be possible? So we'll start with a brief definition of organizational culture. It's something that we talk about a lot, but how does it really manifest? When we think of organizational culture, it's often the set of values and beliefs and ways of acting and interacting in an organization that are considered normal. I like to call it the rules of engagement. So can we do this? Is this acceptable? What is considered normal within any given organization? And if you've ever worked for different organizations, even in the same line of work, you may notice that everyone has just a slightly different way of interpreting what's right, what's normal, what's useful, what's accepted. So for example, when I was teaching at Boston College, the normal dress for professors was basically suit and tie or dress. When I moved out to California, going into the same kind of university setting, professors wore blue jeans and open collar shirts. So that's part of the culture. You may notice if you go to a faith organization, what the norm is and what the range of possibilities is in terms of how people dress to come to church. It may differ from one church to another, or from one place of worship to another. So that these things you notice are often implicit. They're not written down anywhere, but somehow people just know, here you can do that, here you can't do that. What's really important about organizational culture is also to realize that it influences the power dynamics and what we'll call who can sit at the table. So how are promotions made? What do you have to do to be known within an organization? Whose voices get heard and whose voices get ignored? All of these things are wrapped up into the culture of an organization. So I'd like to talk about what influences organizational culture. And I have my own names for some of these theories that you may be familiar with. So the melting pot theory, this was the theory of how America is formed. Everybody can come to America and become a part of the American dream. You're welcome, but then there's a caveat, as long as you fit in. And so, for example, as our business organizations were often led by men, almost always led by men, women who came into these organizations were expected to act like men. You know, they were to dress in a way that was not at all feminine, sensual, sexual, anything like that. And to fit in this melting pot theory, we all had to align with values that were already being represented. The next one is what I call the masculine approach to performance. And notice I don't say male, but masculine, because there's an energy of discipline, of hard work, no exceptions, follow the rules. And I would say that even in this approach, both men and women found themselves really constrained. But it was a very predominant system and culture for organizations for many years, and in some places, unfortunately, may still be. Meritocracy approach, I also can call it the meritocracy myth, because it's a really strong underlying belief here in American society that everyone can get there if you just try hard enough and follow the existing rules. And many of us, as we listen to this, may find it familiar that we've been in systems where that was seemingly true, but underneath there were many other things that were operating in the culture. And then we move from the idea of a melting pot, which makes us all homogenous and fitting in, to an idea of what I call the stew approach. So if you have ever cooked a stew, you know that there's lots of different things that go into it. You have different vegetables. If you eat meat, there's different forms of meat. There's seasonings. All of these things make the dish perfect. But you'll notice that many are welcome, but culture determines which elements are most important and the appropriate mix. So, for example, when we first moved to integrated university environments, the idea was everybody is welcome on campus. And at the same time, if there were too many Black students who were gathered together, people started to suspect something must be going on and there's danger here. So many are welcome, but you're supposed to fit into a particular role once you get here. So all of these things have an influence on the cultures that we see in our organizations today. So it's really important to know that diversity, equity, and inclusion propose a threat to existing culture. In the previous slide, we saw how all of these things are set so that people know what to do, they know what to expect. And once you learn what a culture expects, then you know how to fit in. As soon as we start to talk about bringing in diversity and issues of equity and inclusion, it brings in unknowns. All of a sudden, this nice, smooth, easy sailing foundation that we all agree to gets shaken up, and it challenges the existing norms. For any of us who have seen movies of back in the 50s, when we first started bringing in integration, when women first started coming into the workplace, it was, well, but you know, we men go off and we smoke cigars together and we discuss business there, and women can't be included in that. And all of a sudden, when women started saying, but yes, we're part of the decision-making body here, the whole way of interacting needed to shift. When I first went to Boston College as a professor there, it was told that on the lunch hour, the important people went jogging, and they jogged around the lake or the reservoir, whatever it was. Well, at that time, I didn't jog. And so suddenly it became, so how do I hear what's going on and how decisions are made and have a voice? I had to find a different way to do it. And it wasn't just automatically opened up to me because now I was a woman and a person of color in this formerly all-white institution. So you can see that it rocks the status quo. People come in and they ask questions. Well, why is it this way? And usually the answer they get back is, it's always been this way. And then we have to start pushing against, but what does that mean? And can we be more inclusive in doing this? So it's really important to recognize that it will undermine the existing power structures, the way things are done, the things that people know, who's on top, as well as we talked about before, who gets to sit at the table. So what happens when people feel threatened? Because when we bring in notions of diversity, equity, inclusion, when we rock the boat, people are going to feel threatened by it. And these fear responses are really important to recognize because they're part of what we as human beings do when what is normal for us gets shaken up. And you may be familiar with these fear responses, but I want to talk about how they show up in organizations. Our first response might be to fight back. And this is where people in power will hold on tighter to that power. They may even retaliate against people who promote change. And we have certainly seen evidence of that in our society and in our government recently. More attempts to exert control. Rather than letting things get too out of control, we'll rein it in. Maybe we'll just postpone and say, yes, that's important, but we're not going to really focus on that right now. Or they rationalize it away. Well, you know, if it were really that important, it would have been something that we would have thought about 10 years ago. And maybe those things that you're talking about are really the fault of the people who haven't stood up to their all of the things that they can be in the world, the meritocracy approach, for example. The other thing that they might respond with is to fight or run away. You plan a really beautiful diversity training and people don't show up, or the people who most need it don't come, or they come, but they don't say anything. They're apathetic. Maybe if I don't do anything at all, it'll just go away. Maybe if I don't say anything, if I just kind of nod my head and keep on doing things the way I've always done it, maybe nobody will notice. Maybe after people forget about George Floyd, we can go back to business as usual. And the other thing, and probably the most harmful thing for those of us who are really dedicated to making changes and increasing inclusion, is they make wrong. You're wrong because you make me feel uncomfortable. And They may tell you all the ways that you're wrong, that you shouldn't bring this up, that this isn't relevant right now, or that your approach even is wrong. And I will say, in the years that I've been doing diversity work, I've worked with for-profit, nonprofit, large organizations, small organizations, and almost always there's at least one person who shows up and does the make wrong. They turn it back on me or on other racialized groups that it's our fault that we're bringing this up now, or that the way that we're bringing it up isn't correct, or whatever. They find some way to make those of us who are trying to make the changes and trying to have voices where we've not had voices before be the ones who are actually wrong. Another place that we see this, many of you are familiar with D'Angelo's book on white fragility. And there are a lot of people who argue back that her approach is totally wrong and find nothing at all of value in what she's saying because they're feeling really threatened. So what can we do? And I invite you to pause just for a moment and look at these three images. And notice if there's a place that you can see yourself in one of these images. What can we do? So the first thing to do is to expect that this is going to happen. All of the fear responses that I just talked about are going to show up. And the first thing to do is to bring compassion and not get discouraged. I have to say, when I first started doing diversity work, I wasn't aware that these responses were normal, and I did get discouraged. I'd have great big plans, I'd take time, I was thoughtful in my presentation, and when the backlash came back at me, I would come home really discouraged. What I learned to do was be compassionate for people who are struggling, and a lot of people are struggling and uncomfortable right now when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. The second really important thing is to find allies. Look for those who have either formal, through authority and position in the organization, or informal power, those that other people listen to, and bring them in to support the change. And if you're one of the people who have power in your organization, make sure that you're using your power and your privilege and recruit other people to join you. You're the one whose voices people listen to. Bring your voice to the conversation and invite, literally wrap your arms around other people and bring them in to join you with it. Next, focus on possibilities. And one of the things that I've learned in working with organizations are interested in the bottom line, whether it's a for-profit bottom line or if it's an intention bottom line. So many of our spiritual organizations have an intention to make a change in the world, to bring in more love, more acceptance, more compassion, help bring to the forefront how diversity, equity, and inclusion can actually move the organization forward in its goals, in its values, in its mission. What's good for people in organizations. And there's lots of research that shows when people feel more included, when they feel a sense of belonging, they perform better, they're more satisfied, there's greater rapport within the organization, greater teamwork, and greater creativity. So I encourage you to read and to arm yourself with the data, with the evidence that inclusion makes a difference. And one of the great ways of doing this is to find other organizations like yours who are publishing what they're doing and their successful inclusion efforts. I recently wrote a curriculum on diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism for a global health organization. And one of the things that I did to help the managers recognize that this is important was to cite research of competing companies that were already doing this and having success, how it affected their bottom line, how it affected the satisfaction. So if you can bring in the data, the studies, and they're very easy to find because this is a hot topic on the web right now. Bring that in to use to support your arguments, your approaches. And really, most important, encourage each other. Share what you're doing, give support, and in addition to brainstorming, thinking through things, what I call heartstorming. Like bring your heart, your love, your intention, your feelings into this. Because a lot of us have a lot of passion for this work that we're doing. And that passion matters. And find other people who can support you and encourage you and work with you. Even if we're in different industries, in different parts of the country, we can work together and learn together and keep growing together. So I'd like to complete with a Martin Luther King quote. And one of my favorite sayings is, love is the answer, what's the question? So we know that our answer here is love. And if you are not familiar with Chloe Valdary, she's a 27-year-old entrepreneur who recently is putting forth what she's calling a theory of enchantment as a way of addressing inclusion and diversity. And she has a consulting firm where she works from this principle of love at the core. And so as you read this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, it is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. Type of understanding, goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. And so it's our time, and we are the ones. So I'll stop the share here and we'll open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Cosey. Do you see that there are already some questions in the chat? So maybe let us start with those. And then I see that Adelaide has raised her hand as well.
Okay.
Dr. Louise, Professor Louise also.
All right. Can you explain a little more the difference between the melting pot and the stew? Yes. So the melting pot idea is that once people get here, and you can think of it as we welcome immigrants, especially back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, they were expected to fit into the existing society, not change it very much. And so there were places that people were welcomed as long as they fit into what already existed. And so I gave the example, for example, that women coming into all male businesses were expected to act like men, to be strong, to be courageous, to not show vulnerability, definitely not be crying on the job or anything like that. And that was the norm. The stew idea is, you could say, a more recent idea about immigration, where certain groups of people are welcome to come into certain roles. So for example, here in California, Vietnamese people came in and they took over nail salons. In many societies, in many places in the country, Chinese could come in and have laundries. Jewish people were said to be good with money, so they could be in banking. But you didn't see, for example, a lot of Chinese people in banking, or a lot of African-American people. We were welcomed into arts, music, and athletics, but not in the banking or not on Wall Street or other places. So the stew could contain lots of different people who could, like, in some ways stay in their own chunks. Carrots could still be carrots. They didn't have to blend in and be tomato soup, for example, but it's still an idea of only certain people in certain ways. I hope that's helpful in describing the difference. Do you think if we start saying marginalized groups are focused on equity versus equality, this will help with the explanation of why extra steps are necessary for inclusion? Yes, and there's often a lot of confusion between the words equity and equality. And I think the word equality was used particularly back in the civil rights movement and got a lot of pushback. Well, if you want to be equal, all you have to do, meritocracy, is just step up and do things the way we say things should be done. And everybody has an equal chance. What we learned about with equity, and there's a really beautiful diagram that I will include in the materials afterwards that shows the difference between equality is giving everybody the same thing. Equity is giving everybody the same opportunity. So if people were standing looking over a fence that was right here, and you give a box that's this tall, a person who is 6'6" is going to be looking over the fence. And a person who's 5'2", the fence would actually be coming right here. Equity is equalizing the opportunity for people to be able to step forward. And in that sense, focusing on equity, I think, will move us much further forward. Okay. Hate is too great a burden, choose love. Absolutely. Thank you. Also a salad bowl. That's another good analogy, where each group adds their culture to make a better salad and everyone maintains their culture. Absolutely true.
So may I just allow Adelaide to ask her question and then Professor Quiros.
Dr. Cosey, I don't know if you had any of my granddaughters, but they're Boston College graduates and they're in their 20s, early 20s. But my question is, because I'm on the horns of a dilemma right now. I'm a longtime member of American Association of University Women, and what has come up for this next gathering and vote is to remove the requirement of having a university degree, to give more equity, and frankly, to get more people to be members, because a lot of us are older and kind of getting on in years. And I'm trying very hard to understand people who say, well, then we won't be the university women, and argue the point that, yes, that's true, but as you were just talking about equity, it would be a very worthwhile thing to be able to include people who have not had the benefit of college, or in my case, affording it a little bit as a Brooklyn graduate of a local school. It took me a while to get my degree.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts?
Mm-hmm. So I would look at the charter of the organization and see if there are other values within the mission statement and the charter that speak to the quality and the kind of person that you want in the organization. Having a university degree is perhaps one of the qualities of one of the characteristics of entrance as it has been. But if you can bring in people who fulfill all of the other characteristics, qualities, and will forward your mission, that's a better place to argue from.
Thank you. That's one of my arguments, but it's all been online at this point because we're not having any in-person meetings, sadly.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you, Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Corey.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Professor.
Yes.
Professor Quiros, are you there?
Yes, unmute yourself. There you go.
I'm sorry. I really appreciate your entire talk and the PowerPoint presentation. The order was phenomenal and a lot to clarify a lot of things. I want to make a point of two parts that I found very interesting. As when you asked, what can we do? The first one was inclusion. I have found that this country, the United States, is too far from getting, decades far from being, for getting muscle memory into being inclusive, that we're not even close to understanding what inclusion is, especially the way education is organized, zip codes, the way they're organized. So I have found that in order for us to be effective and make a difference, that even for those of us where inclusion may be more automatic or more muscle, like muscle memory, that it helps to be walk into environments totally conscious of our inclusion. That inclusion is not automatic. You're just not an inclusive person, even at our level. Even at the level that I believe I'm at, because I've lived excluded. So I find myself having to be totally conscious. Okay, I'm going to enter this room now. I'm going to probably feel, separated anyway, as per my pattern. But even if it's even if it's within Black and Latino environment, I still have to go in there being conscious of being inclusive. So I think conscious inclusivity is very important. That we should not take it for granted. And the other point in finding allies, when you wrote, when it's written, look for those with power. One of the things that I included also in my books is that I'd like everybody to understand that they're standing on power, that they are power. And I would love to see somebody that's not expected to speak up or create controversy to say something, because that person would make a greater impact than somebody with power, because somebody with power, we already know what they're going to say. It's like talking to the choir. But if we could start believing that we have all power, standing on power, and speak up, and the power dynamics changes, and it really goes up a lot of different levels. Gee, I didn't expect that person to say that finally, and it's much more impressive that somebody, well, I already know what's going to talk, and they go to, it doesn't have the same impact. So I'd like us all to understand, to teach our kids from a very young age, and from there on after, anybody that we come into, to understand we have power and we cannot desert it.
Thank
And
you.
that's all I want to say. Thank you for being here. And also, my great grandfather, and I'm part Venezuelan, half Venezuelan, and I graduated from one of the great universities in Venezuela, one of the oldest in the world, and he had a PhD in political science and law.
Dr. Kuras, I'm going to ask you to
Yes,
just stop you there. Thank you so much for those comments. I agree with you about standing on power. Let's hear from Liz and Joe. Eugene, let me know if somebody is actually waving their hand.
I haven't seen that yet.
All right.
Liz?
Should I go next?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm CEO of a nonprofit organization in a very white space, conservation, and we were called out on Facebook, so it became a crisis for our board of directors that we do something. And so in that haste, we chose a consultant to help us. And after hearing your presentation today, I think we chose the wrong consultant. If our board and our leadership team had heard your presentation, I think we'd be in a much different place today. So I don't even know what my question is, because I have so many questions and I don't want to take up too much time. But one, can I share your presentation with our staff, or can I hire you to help us?
Well, you can certainly hire me, and I'd be more than happy to have a more conversation with you.
Okay, great.
And I just want to say, I echo how challenging it is for a consultant to come in. As we looked at all of the resistance, if you're not aware that this resistance is likely to happen, the focus of the approach can so easily get sidetracked, and then nothing good happens.
Well, we're so committed to doing this work
Mm-hmm.
that we need the right approach, I think, I hope. I mean, we're so committed, and it's not turning out that way at all. But
I
just
understand.
yeah,
Yes,
okay,
I totally understand.
great,
I'd be very happy to have more conversation with you.
great.
And you'll have my contact information. I can put it in the chat before we finish.
Fantastic.
Thank you,
Thank
Liz.
you.
Joe, please.
Thank you, Lane. Thank you, Dr. Cosey. It's so good to see you again. And I want to thank you because I think this was what you said this morning it was a very helpful understanding why everyone quotes doesn't get it. You know, you described what those folks, perhaps unlike us, who resist and are feeling uncomfortable, you helped us to better understand what they are feeling, what they are experiencing, and why they just don't understand things the way that maybe this group understands things. And I think that's very helpful to understand where some people might be. Here's my question for you. Dr. Cosey, can you provide any examples of a breakthrough moment or experience where those who had previously resisted engagement in this kind of work somehow converted and their attitude changed and they became engaged? I'm thinking about faith communities where we have social justice teams and we have a mass of folks who are very interested in this work and participate in every possible activity, but then we have many members who are just uncomfortable, and you can feel the tension, that they are just not comfortable doing any of this. And I'm just asking, do you have any stories where you can give us a real life example of how that kind of conversion is capable of taking place and what we can do, I can do, all of us can do to help make that happen?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I can. I could tell you lots of different stories, both of things that did not work as well as things that worked better. So microaggressions is one of the areas that's typically approached and talked about in diversity work. And you can give a theoretical definition of a microaggression. You can have people talk about when they've committed them or when they've received them. And often people go, well, that's never happened to me, or I don't understand why this is so important. If you're familiar with a microaggression, it's something that's often unintentional. It's a seemingly small thing for the person delivering it, but something that happens over and over and over again for the person receiving. And so the first time that we talked about microaggressions in a nonprofit organization I was working with, I got well, I don't understand why this is important and why do we have to go through it. And like they were in my face. And so I realized I need a different approach here. And so I started talking to people who said they'd never experienced microaggressions and asking them really specific questions. So have you, for example, as a white man, ever been in a situation where everybody else was joking about something that didn't include you? Well, yeah. And how did that feel? Oh, well, and did it happen more than one time? And did you experience growing up? And so once I could start to put it into people's experience field, the ahas started to happen. Oh, you mean that's what it's like? And often in this area, when people are feeling uncomfortable, they need to be able to relate it to something personal to them, not something that they've done wrong, because people will react to, I've been the microaggressor. I don't want to hear that I've been that. But if you can relate it to a feeling, oh, this is what it feels like to be left out, to be not included, to be called names, to be pushed aside, to be, oh, that's what we're talking about? Now people are engaged and more willing. So really, really important that in doing our work, there's no sense of make wrong, because people get defensive when they feel like they're being told they did something wrong and they stop listening. So that would be one example of how to shift things. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. We have Betsy, and then Amber is back.
Thank you. I have a statement and then a question. The statement is that you had a wonderful slide where you said diversity, equity, inclusion pose a threat to the existing culture, and you had a list of how people will react. I have to say, if you took out the term diversity, equity, inclusion and put in climate change, fighting climate change, it's the exact same thing, which is fighting climate change poses a threat to the existing culture of wealth and institutionalists and big white men in this country, and that their reaction is to say it's wrong, meaning that there is no climate change. So it's very interesting, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's my statement. And then, Dr. Cosey, I'm so happy that you're teaching Stanford business students these kind of things. So it's so hopeful for our future in this country. But do you hear any interesting pushback from them, given their youth or potentially given their privilege, that would be interesting to share? That's different from anything else you've said so far.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you mentioned the word privilege, because this is the place where people often get tripped up. When people say you have privilege, people want to go, no, I don't, you know, and privilege is often put as a power over dynamic. And one of the things that we talk about at Stanford is the power forward rather than the power over. And so students often come into the diversity of, and especially with international students, that's a US problem. We don't have this problem in our country. And as we start to talk about how it manifests and how people feel and the impact that it has on their ability to perform, on their ability to have a voice, on the ability to be influential, they start to make the connections. And what's exciting to me is these graduate students, they are either current or will be CEOs, presidents, running corporations, doing startups, and they're getting a foundation of thinking about the people that they're working with and how to bring them in a way both that has the people feel better, more satisfied, but also to get more productivity, which they're often focused on. And when they can see the connection between those, I can't tell you how exciting it is for me to watch the minds open up. Yeah. And in many ways, I will say, students in their 20s and 30s haven't had as long a tradition of the old culture as many of us have. And it's a little bit easier, actually, to break through the resistance. Thank you for asking.
Amber, would you like to unmute?
Oh, sorry. I don't know if my question is more of a question or a statement, but I'm trying to. Let me just start with that. I used to work for a large investment bank as a learning and development coordinator, and one of the things that I was in charge of were ethics courses. And there came a time where the company decided that they wanted to invest more on inclusion and diversity type training. And I remember we went out and tried to find diversity trainers to try to teach these courses. And the first consultant agency we went to was a consultant agency out of the UK. And that I can't even speak about what went on in that conversation, but it wasn't effective. And then we tried another company here in America, and again, wasn't that effective. As I was listening to Liz's question to you, I was brought back to that moment, thinking about how hard it was to find a consulting company that even had the diversity group that we were trying to talk to. You know, most of the consultants were white, and most of the consultants were men, and they were teaching on a topic that, you know, was a little sensitive, and you could tell they weren't really comfortable with it. But in me going on social media and talking to other minorities, and asking them, okay, well, how can we create allies? How can we teach this, what our needs are? A lot of them felt exhausted, exasperated. They didn't want to do the work because to them, it was too much. And so I guess my question is, does it matter who is teaching these theories? Doesn't matter where the messaging is coming from? Do you think if you're not a person of color, or if you're not a woman or a part of the LGBTQ community, that others who want to be allies would be able to explain or articulate to people who are non-allies what is exactly they're doing wrong? Or do you think it's really should be best left to that marginalized group?
You ask a very deep and very interesting question. And I want to start by saying most organizations, when they say they want diversity, equity, and inclusion work, have no idea what they really want. And the first thing that any consultant coming into an organization needs to do is ask some really deep questions. Why do you want this? How does it fit in with your bottom line, your current culture, your current philosophy, and what are you willing to change? And I have to say, I learned the hard way to ask these questions, because probably like many of the other early consultants, I came in pretty naive. Oh, yay, great, you want this, I'm gonna bring it. And then it's met with resistance. To answer your question about who as a consultant, I'm really in favor of pairs or teams of consultants, so there's more representation. So for example, you might have an African-American woman and a white man. I've seen that as a pairing that works in an organization, because the white man can speak to the white men in a way that they are likely to be less defensive because it's, quote, coming from one of their own. It's not necessary, but what is important is that you get the right person with the right philosophy and approach for your organization. And some organizations need a hard, data-driven, this is why it's important, this is why it's how it's going to affect the bottom line, this is what will get people's attention. Other organizations need a softer hand. Let's come from love. Let's find our places of connection. And there's lots in between that. So I would encourage any of you who are hiring consultants to make sure when you're interviewing them, you're asking them about their approach and seeing that it matches with your organization's goals and mission. Thank you. Great question.
That was. Tyrone, I see your hand. I would like to ask a question, if that's okay. So Dr. Williams-Cosey, so we saw after, well, recently, many of our larger well-known corporations announcing that they've now launched all these, more aggressive diversity programs and training and so forth. And I am just praying that some of our lesser known companies are doing the same thing. How will they know when they've achieved true inclusion? Like, are there some rubrics? How will we know that what they're saying they're after is working?
Mhm. I feel it's really important to do before and after surveys with all of the employees that are anonymous. So people, you're going to be asking really specific questions around power dynamics in the organization, um, satisfaction, and as a consultant, I actually attend the meetings of the organization, and I look and I see who speaks and who's heard and what's considered and what's not. And I bring that to the attention of the leadership, because a lot of this stuff is so implicit that people don't see it. And then you want to do an after survey after the intervention and look at what has changed. Are people feeling more satisfied? Is their voice more heard? Are they feeling more equity in the distribution of resources? And you can actually, there's an equity audit, and many of you who are interested, look this up, equity audit. You can hire somebody to come in and do an equity audit before an intervention and have it repeated afterwards. So there's standardized questions that can be asked that give you some data on what has actually changed. But you'll also see it in the way that people interact with each other. As Dr. Quiros mentioned, people feel more involved, more engaged. They're signing up for things. They're showing up for things. And it should show up in some performance change as well.
Thank you for answering that question. All right, Joan and Joe, if we have some time.
So a shout out to Lynn and to Suzette. They're part of our spiritual family, so good to have y'all on the set. So Dr. Cosey, you sure do make nasty medicine taste awful good. You know, and what I'm saying by that is that you have done over the years, and I've witnessed this, blow people's minds, right? You walk in a room, they say there's another Black woman. By the time you finish talking, they go, wow, she's an amazing, exceptional person. And that's true. But could you speak to the difference between being an exception and being an example? I think there's a distinction between those two.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Kamala said it most recently, most effectively. I may be the first person coming into this, but I'm not the last. And so I've been blessed to lead global workshops for the past 20 years all around the world. And I walk into a group of people in the UK or in Australia or in Japan, and I know the first thing that they see is Black, woman, American, in that order. And again, very much to what Dr. Quiros was saying, I bring my inclusion with me. So my attitude as I'm looking out at them is one of all of us, not me and y'all or you people. And one of the important things I know without saying, I am here to change your attitude about African American women and African American people, that by my presence, I'm doing that. And I've watched an organization that was, I won't say primarily white, it was pretty much all white, especially at the leadership level, slowly begin to bring in people of color, LGBTQ, younger people, and have an emphasis on expanding diversity. And I know in part it's because I opened the door. And more than opening the door, I open people's eyes to a different way of seeing, a different experience. Because a lot of our biases and prejudices come from lack of information and lack of experience. So we see African American people on TV and we think all of them are either athletes or rap artists or whatever. But I walk into a place and they see someone who speaks articulate English and they go, oh, there's a different possibility here. And then the next person who comes in, their expectations have broadened just a little bit. So that's a lot of what I'm here for and about in this world. Thank you, Tyra.
By the way, that wasn't overnight, right? That was over 23,
Oh, this is over 20, 30 years. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So thank you. That brings us to the close of another Race Talk with Lane and Eugene. Dr. Felicia Williams-Cosey, thank you so much. I hope that you can tell that we really did enjoy your chat and took a lot away from this. We invite you back anytime. I hope it's okay that I will share your contact information in a follow-up email.
Yes,
or you can, why don't you just give it right now? People want to write it down. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So Eugene, can you just say, I know that we're closing down, would you just say a little bit about our guest and what he's going to talk about next week?
Yes, next week we're having Reverend Masanda Hiraoka, who will be speaking to us on a topic that I didn't even have in my wheelhouse or in my frame of reference at all. The, oh darn, every time I talk about it, I forget what I'm talking about. The theory.
The model minority myth.
The model minority myth, not theory, the model minority myth, where, you know, there are certain races of people, Asians and specifically, who are looked at as the model minority. They don't do anything wrong. And Reverend Masanda will talk about the impact on that within that culture. It's going to be a good one. He's a wonderful presenter. I think my brother Masanda's in his 30s, maybe 38. Yes, it's going to be great. I've worked with him quite a few times. So be here, tell a friend, be a friend, bring a friend.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. We love you.
Thank you, Dr. Felicia. All right, Tyrone. Lynn Daniels, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.